Hi everyone, my name is Cara Stacey. I'm joining you from Johannesburg. I am going to share my screen quickly and then I can start properly. Right. Firstly, many thanks to Theo and to the Bode Electrons team for inviting me back again. I think I've been a part of most of the Bode Electrons since it started. And I'm very happy to be back here and talk about this kind of new work that I've been thinking about and that I've been working on this year so far. So the title of my talk today is Soft Architecture in Sound: Reflections on Hierarchies, Chance, and Change. If you're not familiar with my work, I'm a musician, a composer, and a researcher. I'm based in Johannesburg, as I said. I'm a senior lecturer in African music at Northwest University in Potchefstroom, on the Potchefstroom campus. And I've been working as a musician and educator for quite a while now. My presentation today is titled, as you can see over there, Soft Architecture in Sound. And in this talk, I'll be reflecting on the idea of soft architecture in musical practice and in my practice in particular. To start off, I should say that earlier this year, I was invited to a writing retreat by the architectural scholars Amina Kaskar from WISER and the University of Leuven in Belgium, and Hannah Leroux from Wits University. The whole project was related to Amina's PhD work on Afro-Asian spatial practices and soft architecture. But the writing meeting brought together a group of architects, theorists, an anthropologist, and myself as a musician. Having been acquainted with the extravagant archi-talk of architectural studies through my father, who's an architect, I wasn't sure what to expect from this weekend, and I had no idea how this idea of soft architecture would relate to my day-by-day practice. This presentation today is an attempt to reflect on what soft architecture is and how this idea can be productive for people in music, especially as we try to make sense of transformation and restrictive hierarchies amongst musical notes, systems, and people. So what is soft architecture? In starting this work, I had to understand how architecture itself is defined. Kenneth Frampton, in his essay, The Status of Man and the Status of His Objects, contemplates the ambiguity of the term by drawing on two differing Oxford English Dictionary definitions of architecture, which you can see on the slide here. Firstly, the art or science of constructing edifices for human use, but then also the action and process of building. Architecture, in a strict sense, is built from drawings, as composed scored music is played from a score. The Oxford English Dictionary definitions here highlight two different meanings of architecture, one as intent and one as practice. This ambiguity forms an interesting and uneven foundation for the differentiation between soft and hard architectures. And here, Sarah McPherson's definition of the two is perhaps helpful, or was helpful for me at least. Quote, while hard architecture encloses spaces and arrests forms, soft architecture signifies effective relations, both actual and virtual. And in the background here, you can see an image from Studio Arkel, their work titled Soft Architecture, which was part of a material research project in 2018. In architecture, it seemed at first that softness can mean everything that makes up a space in real life and digitally, and there is a whole digital part to the thinking around this term, everything beyond the steel, brick, and mortar of permanent structures. From discussions with the writing group I was included in, this could be daily habits, heirlooms, performances of certain social relations. In the call for this project, Amina Kaskar described her interest in soft architecture as how, quote, cultural forms, identity, and memory, end quote, materialize in space. But there are understandings beyond that, and the term itself has been flexibly adapted by poets such as Lisa Robinson, visual artists, and others. And I guess I am doing exactly that same work, but now in the context of music. A variety of scholars writing about softness in architecture reference the controversial architect and founder of the MIT Media Lab, Nicholas Negroponte, and his 1970 book, The Architecture Machine, from MIT Press. In this, he proposed a new type of architecture without architects, asserting that an individual is the best designer of his or her own space. It seems to be from the 1970s onwards that scholars began to examine how people work with the hardness in the spaces around them to be comfortable, to build homes and spaces that reflect their own identities. Some innovative work that playfully explored this and other fluidities was done by British architect and maverick Cedric Price. The image on the first, my opening slide, was from his Bat Hat project. More recently, the work of Italian architects Marco Ferrari and Cristina Galizzioli in what they call textile architecture reimagines an architecture in which walls and floors are replaced by textile surfaces, quote, challenging solid building conventions and exploring soft spatial possibilities, end quote. There are intuitive, decolonial, and material ways in which soft architecture has been and can be understood and used in architectural practice and scholarship. John Russell Beaumont described buildings as soft characters in our lives, animate, thinking, and emotive beings which actively house and protect us physically as well as psychologically. You can see that quote over there from 2015. James Chapman writes about vernacular building as a soft approach to creating spaces, quote, leading to an architecture whose presence is not desperate or screaming, and whose creation involves a minimum of violence and disturbance to land and people. It's an architecture that works with natural systems rather than trying to conquer them, end quote. And Joseph Darman of the Peter Wall Institute of Advanced Studies, University of British Columbia, considers the softness as it relates to building fabric, energy consumption, and waste in buildings. You can see his work on YouTube. He's given a couple of public talks on this. His work explores degradable and locally harvested materials for any building site through site soil bricks and mushroom spore as insulation, as well as other innovations. Amina Kaska is definitely not the first person to explore the diverse meanings of soft architecture, though her work brings light to the ways in which people build space and remember in Afro-Asian migratory context. And as a South African scholar, she's obviously working from this particular context. Having considered the fluidity of both the term architecture and soft architecture, sorry for my dog barking, I'll now move on to how this could relate to music and how I've thought of it in terms of my own creative practice. So if we understand soft architectures as diverse strategies for making home, making space, and remembering as an alternative action to hard architectures, then there's some direct ways in which we can understand soft architecture in sound and music. Norwegian architect and musician Havard Tveito, I'm definitely mispronouncing that, has written briefly about soft architecture in sound. Quote, one may view the way sound transforms a physical space in this way. At first glance, sound may seem fluid and almost immaterial, but sound has very distinct physical properties, end quote. He highlights the ability of sound to rapidly transform a space, drawing on the work of Philip Rahm and his exploration of music's ability to take on architectural forms. From my perspective, these are all really interesting considerations and avenues for further exploration. For the purpose of this presentation, I'm highlighting my initial reflections on soft architecture in sound and how these relate to my own creative practice. So I've gone in a slightly different direction. Just as softness in architecture can be understood as alternative design approaches, or the lack thereof, actual building materials, responsive environmental strategies in construction, interior modifications, recipes, fabric, heirlooms, and so on, it seems to me that softness in music can speak to composer-performer roles and responsibilities, score realizations, sound design and acoustics, subaltern musical scenes, instrumental histories, memory, interpretation, and a sound in itself. My thinking led me back to de Soto's The Practice of Everyday Life from 1984, in which he writes about strategy and tactic. Quote, I call a strategy the calculus of forced relationships which become possible when a subject of will and power, a proprietor, an enterprise, a city, a scientific institution, can be isolated from an environment. A strategy assumes a place that can be circumscribed as proper, and thus serve as the basis for generating relations with an exterior distinct from it, competitors, adversaries, clienteles, targets, or objects of research, political, economic, and scientific rationality has been constructed on this strategic model. He goes on to say, I call a tactic, on the other hand, a calculus which cannot count on a spatial institutional localization, nor thus on a borderline distinguishing the other as a visible totality. The place of the tactic belongs to the other, end quote. De Soto makes direct links to what I would understand as Cascar's soft architecture in his third chapter from the same publication, when he writes about the, quote, identification of a person by the place in which he lives and works, end quote, and one's making do amongst systems. And there's a whole systems part to soft architecture as well, especially once people start working or thinking about the digital aspects of this term and the practices around it as well. The hard and soft aspects I've drawn out here from architectural scholarship can be seen as related to de Soto's strategies and tactics. And you can read a lot of de Soto in a lot of not only the architects who've contributed to the literature on soft architecture, but also the artists and other practitioners. And it's from this point at which I can see numerous conflations with music making from my experience. So as highlighted by my move that over there. As highlighted by my title, the first way in which I've thought about soft architecture is under the term hierarchies. Much has been written on notions of the work, the author, and the composer in classical music, and many of the rigidities around these ideas and figures can be seen in other musics too. Here I think of any canonical works like John Coltrane's Love Supreme, his composition Giant Steps, the Mbira composition Nyama Musasa, even albums by Radiohead, Beyonce, and Mac Miller. The prestige attached to coming up with a musical idea at its best values the creative voice, and at its worst, creates a framing for the performer as a mere vessel. In all of the above examples, the reality of those creative utterances is a much more complicated network of composer-performer intentions, responses, and responsibilities, enmeshed strategies and tactics. I recently had to think through the barriers to entry that in particular guard what a work is, the perceived best techniques and aesthetics behind the work and behind the composer. In my year as the Standard Bank Young Artist for Music, I was approached by the National Arts Festival to create a series of video workshops helping young people at a high school level to compose their own music. At the start of 2020, I was fortunate enough to meet Raven Chacon, the composer, noise musician, conceptual artist, and recently the Pulitzer Prize winner in the US. His approach to all his art making was inspirational, but in particular, I was inspired by his work teaching young people with very limited musical education to write for string quartet. Having studied composition during my undergraduate and postgraduate studies, the thought that a young person who knew only a handful of chords on the guitar or who had no experience of playing music at all could be taught within 1 week to express themselves through a string quartet is so powerful, and in itself points out the glaring and constructed limitations we place in front of young people and ourselves in imagining composers and new music makers. Being less than a brilliant Pulitzer Prize winner myself, it was then my task to think about how to create a workshop series, a video workshop series, in which I taught and encouraged young people to compose. The program had to speak to the music curriculum across all high school levels, but also had to be doable for different high schools, so public and private, well-resourced and less well-resourced, and across the whole country. In essence, it was an empty slate, but with lots of weighty parameters to consider. But as Stravinsky said, there's no creativity without limitations, and I use that as my inspiration. Here's an outline of what I'd planned to do and the details of the team who helped me bring to life this program. You can see over here Mzwandile Buthelezi, Keenan Arntz. So Mzwandile Buthelezi being a visual artist, Keenan Arntz a jazz guitarist, Jonas Wheatman a drummer primarily, mostly in jazz, but plays lots of other musics, and also a guitarist and songwriter. And then Paul Modikeng, who I think everybody here probably knows, a musician from Lesotho who plays a multi-instrumentalist, plays lots of indigenous instruments. So we essentially made 7 different videos in which we had to put in graded exercises that helped people build up compositional confidence, but also kind of covered quite a bit of music theory as well. And at the same time had to not be style, it's kind of genre specific. So it was a really interesting experience. I'll say a little bit about how I kind of broke down each video, and I asked the team to contribute as well. So everybody was chosen because they had particular strengths and weaknesses, and not weaknesses, lots of strengths, but also had particular compositional interests as well and experiences. And so, yeah, essentially, I thought the best way to do this would be to break everything down into musical elements. And so each video focused on a different thing, such as timbre, rhythm, melody. And then one of the final ones, which was quite important and involved Mzondile Buthelezi, the visual artist who I work with a lot, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, was how do we remember what we've composed? So keeping it very, very open. How do we remember what we've composed? Some people might be performers. Primarily, some people might be classical flute players. Some people might be producers who have access to free software, or maybe more than that, depending on the resources of the school. So it was a really interesting challenge. And I think seeing also how these very experienced professional musicians approached the challenge of doing this work was really interesting. So I can point out immediately, and you can hear from what I was saying, that I fell back on various hard architectures from my own training, despite trying to work from my own more experimental and real-life practice of being a musician and composer. I was stuck on the idea of students having building blocks from which they could create either a simple or complex musical structure. After all, some of the students we were speaking to had grade 8 piano and had studied Mussorgsky and Mendelssohn for years. Some may have had no musical training at all, but a lot of real-life musicianship through choirs, or perhaps having elderly musicians in the family who played traditional instruments. And some may have experienced music only as listeners via TV, radio, or YouTube. I thought back to my own sweet Scottish high school music teacher in Eswatini, where I grew up, and the ways in which I was taught to understand basic musical elements. This seemed like it could be a good place to start, as I said before. So for kids needing to build up some kind of musical vocabulary, there were analytical tools, but also kind of small little ideas that we could kind of test out musically. And there were a whole lot of moments within the workshops in which people could improvise to test out, let's say, dynamics, physical communication within an ensemble, in small groups in the classes. And we thought quite carefully about how we broke down some of these tasks to build up the ability to compose. So the resulting sounds could vary wildly, and we made sure that we demonstrated that all strategies, notation systems, and instruments were on the table. By playing very diverse and quite odd, in some cases, pieces of composed and improvised music for drum kit, jazz guitar, piano, voice, musical bows, the Sutu Mamochorong monochord fiddle that you can see here on the slide, indigenous flutes, Mbira variants, and visual art responses as well. Beyond any stylistic boundaries, there were numerous ways in which the students could also integrate chance and improvisatory opportunities in their pieces. In these ways, I aimed for the course to destabilize the expectations of who could be a composer, how one could remember and record one's own musical ideas, how complex or simple a composition could be, and what styles of music could be drawn upon. The resulting pieces are being worked on currently and will be made public for next year's National Arts Festival. And at that point, I may have many more reflections on what educational strategies worked and what tactical responses their strengths and weaknesses inspired. The potential of giving anyone the confidence to compose with a nice sound in ways that are pleasing to them seems endless. By doing this at every level, much of the concretized lack of diversity in musical scenes and institutions can also be chipped away at and subverted. Not all aspects of my reading of soft and hard architectures in music seek to be polemical. The interaction between these mutually reliant dichotomies is interesting to me. And I think I realized that as soon as I started thinking through things with Amina and the rest of the team. Instruments are hard architectures and can either be evasive or comforting. In my own musical practice, the mkhube mouthbow, which you can see here to the right, which I performed with and composed for over 15 years, remains a fixed architecture which can evade my strategies completely. The difficulty of playing and amplifying this instrument, reliant on light friction and subtle overtones, keeps all musicians who play it alert and busy. In contrast, my nyunga nyunga instrument is a technology which I count on and with which I can express myself freely. You can see a nyunga nyunga on the other side, an mbira variant. I think many of you will be familiar with this. The nyunga nyunga, or a karimba mbira, for those who are not familiar with it, is a small musical instrument created from metal keys, as you see there, and a wooden frame, made internationally famous by the Zimbabwean musician Dumisani Maraire, who lived from 1944 to 1999. The nyonga nyonga is an mbira variant, as I've said, a lamellophone, linking it to a dispersed and extensive family tree of music-making devices spread across Zimbabwe, northern South Africa, Mozambique, Zambia, Malawi, DRC, and beyond. My own instrument came to me from my friend Machume Zango, a skilled Mozambican performer and instrument builder who I collaborate with regularly and who tours extensively. The fact that the instrument was made by and placed in my hands by a friend makes it a comfort on stage. I know its sound, I know its feel, I know where it comes from, and I know that it will sound. I'll play just a little bit of an example here, also to stop the talkie and have a little bit of music. You can hear this is a piece of mine called Disa. Right, so I guess in closing about Nyonga Nyonga, I can say that I'm really interested in the way that these kalimba, which also comes from it's the Chibemba word from Zambia, a small musical instrument, come to be our friends at home and away. How they're hard, that can be understood as a hard architecture on stage and elsewhere, and the softness that firstly sonically is emitted from them, but also that nyunga as an instrument, but also other instruments can kind of bring to life all kinds of other sonic ideas and performative experiences as well. Another way in which to consider hard and soft architectures coming together constructively is when we zoom into the sounding of any music. So linking to that, Paulo de Assis writes in the opening of his book, Sound and Score, Essays on Sound, Score, and Notation, quote, "Music inhabits the realms of the invisible. A sound, a melody, a rhythm, an harmonic field, or a cluster are never seen. Starting from an instrument, they travel through the air, reaching the listener as immaterial vibrations of energy." Brian Fernyhough described musical notation, in contrast, as a strange ontological position, a sign constellation referring directly to a further such constellation of a completely different perceptual order. Much has been written about chance, aleatoric music, improvisation, and more experimental and conceptual music in the 20th and 21st centuries. In considering the minutiae of softness in music and sound itself, I've been thinking about the freedom experienced when the concepts tied to notation and planned action are realized, when symbol becomes sound in spaces and in our ears and bodies. Sounds and music are soft and are inherently different to the strategic hardness of all notation. Performers and even their planned interpretations of works can be soft, as I've implied earlier. Performances are most definitely soft. The expectations of an experience on stage are almost always partially or fully defied or challenged in different ways. In this way, the hard architecture of sound rig, notation, instruments, and technology form a scaffolding from which emerges the music itself as planned and tactically beyond plans. Linking to this is a very brilliant Tim Ingold quote, which you can see over here on the slide. One of my favorite scholars. In 2017, he writes, quote, "Sometimes one's best ideas come not from following the main lines of an investigation, but from veering off course in brief encounters with things, artworks, and people that trigger reflections on quite unfamiliar and unexpected topics." This is from his Knowing from the Inside project, one of the publications called Correspondences. I can highly recommend checking out all of the publications from that multi-year project, which are so interesting. A way in which I've been forced to think about hierarchies, composition, and these unexpected encounters has been through my trance and interdisciplinary trio, The Texture of Silence, with jazz guitarist Keenan Arntz and visual artist Mzwandile Buthelezi. As our blurb states, quote, "The Texture of Silence explores the interface between composed and improvised music and visual art. It brings together various indigenous Southern African musical instruments, jazz language, graphic notation for music, and the visual explorations of line art. Across disciplines, we use this project to explore both fixed ideas and spontaneous responses and make new work in this way." In creating our music, we've alternated approaches from Mzwandile, the visual artist, composing for us as musicians, to jointly improvising, to Mzwandile responding visually to our carefully notated and planned compositions, to us interpreting his works as graphic scores with specific or no guiding instructions. In this work, hard and soft architectures interact in different ways, and we're open to all different strategies and tactics. As an example, here's an excerpt, actually I'll play the whole thing, of our interpretation of the graphic score, The Kinetic Nature of Silence. Oh, this is the ensemble in action at National Arts Festival in 2020. And let's have a listen to The Kinetic Nature of Silence. Right. So on to my final consideration, change. Drawing on my earlier reflections, the final way in which I'm thinking about soft architecture in sound is as a framing for change. Turning back to architecture itself, Omar Khan and Philip Beasley have explored the idea of design as a conversation, quote, rather than an exchange of information, end quote. I think there's something very interesting in this formulation, not only in the ways in which composers create with and for performers, but also in thinking about change in my own work. Recent reflections have sent me back to the work of Nemu Younger, Swiss composer Lucas Hubert, which I think who I discussed at Bode Electrons last year with Galina Juritz, and to my own experiences with the Chart Ensemble featured in this year's Bode Electrons as well by Matthijs van Dijk, and the Texture of Silence. I find myself now thinking about technical, appropriate strategies for facilitating transdisciplinary creativity, reflexive compositional collaboration, even with one author or composer, and creativity as a tool for expressing the soft textures of memory, emotional expression, and healing. Drawing on my work with the Texture of Silence and some of my thinking around the Future Arts Educational Program, which I described earlier, I'm currently working on a room-sized graphic score work, which can be interpreted by dancers, actors, and musicians. Participants can choose their own paths and can follow or disregard the strategies presented. And you can see a planning image here from that work, and then one of the tests, which we did in person at the Center for the Less Good Idea. The work is still in development, so I should say that, but hopefully will be presented as part of season 9 of William Kentridge's Center for the Less Good Idea in Johannesburg. So as there are these different strategies and routes that are presented as part of the work, the different starting points, and people can choose to follow the rules or not follow the rules, depending on what they want to do. As the different movements are performed, and due to the chalk and sand score markings on the floor, the details of the score are slowly smudged, erased, and transformed as the work is performed. Here, the design of the hard architecture of the piece simply facilitates a collaboration between different types of artists, which may be possibly difficult or a little bit more challenging or unclear with a different kind of work. Due to the chance elements involved, each iteration and performance is different, and the performers have to remain responsive throughout for it to work. So you can see this initial design on the slide here. In thinking about composition as design built from conversation, I've created a series of new works utilizing different instruments and sounds. Throughout the year, I've been exploring the disruption of chronological narratives that place musical bows and other indigenous Southern African instruments as early defunct tools from which harmonic and melodic material was transferred onto guitars and other Western instruments. In the concert for this, Bowed Electrons, you'll hear a short work of mine in which I explore running my musical bows and other indigenous instruments through a rig of contemporary and vintage guitar effects pedals. The idea behind it is circling around of influence, a reversing of the perceived linear relationship between two tools mutually existent, both historic and contemporary. My other recent work explores conversations between players, technologies, anxieties, instruments, and composers. In conclusion, in my experience, there's so many ways in which we endure and uphold hardness in composition, in music scholarship, and in the academy more broadly. I came across a quote recently which made me laugh, as even the wild, exploratory, and innovative work of experimental art music in the second half of the 20th century was written about by Virginia Anderson in such fixed, rigid, and as the young people would say, violent terms. In her 2019 chapter from the book Sound and Score that I mentioned before, she, citing Nyman, to be fair to her, outlines her use of the term experimental music as strictly Cajun indeterminacy, this is a direct quote, alternative notations, early minimalism, artistic crossovers, and philosophical tenets from around 1951 to 71, end quote. She goes on to describe the need to study the experimental scores in her chapter in detail, quote, by patrolling the border of possibility and impossibility that lies within them. I just thought that wording was so interesting and very telling. In this presentation, I've laid out some of the ways in which I've been critiquing and also embracing soft and hard aspects of my own contemporary musical training and my own practice. There's much to be deconstructed in how composition in classical and other spheres is seen and practiced to allow for or acknowledge the softness that can and does already exist. My own approach of, quote, I can only make the thing that I need to learn next, end quote. I'm quoting here from the artist Sarah Smuts Kennedy. That approach doesn't seem to fit into many of the boxes that brought me here, and was definitely not something I was taught. In this way, the softer aspects of composing and music making as a mode of learning is definitely underdeveloped here in Southern Africa and possibly elsewhere. Alternative framings of how we make music, how we're taught to make music, and how we understand it, I think, are necessary at this point in time. And I hope that I've shown how soft architecture and its diverse meanings and tactical responses to harder elements can be read into broader societal aspects of music pedagogy, but also down into the micro levels of conversation between our building blocks, notes, instruments, players, and composers. I should say here as well that I think, this has been a productive term for me and productive reading as I've read around this and also other ideas from architecture. But I mean, it just shows you how, how much possibility there is in terms of rethinking a lot of what we consider to be really concretized in how we think about composition. So while I'm still at the early stages of this work, it's been really fruitful to think along these lines so far, and there's still a lot of work to be done and things to work out and explore. And I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you so much. Hi, Theo, can you hear me?
Excuse me. Hi, Cara. Yes, can you see me? I don't seem to be able to. There we go.
I can see you.
Great. Thank you, Cara. This was extremely stimulating and interesting. Thank you so much for this. I don't see questions in the chat, so I'm going to fire off the first salvo. Towards the beginning of your presentation, you spoke about an educational project, so getting young people to compose for string quartet. I find this a wonderful and super important field of activities. And my first question regarding that would be whether this is a one-off event or whether it will be forming part of a series of educational workshops, projects.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. It's actually that was the kind of that was a very inspiring moment for me. It wasn't actually my work, but it was this guy from America called Raven Chacon, who is just the most brilliant musician and thinker and person. And so it was a program. I think he does it every year. He didn't grow up on a reservation. I think he's from Arizona somewhere, but there was obviously a reservation for First Nations people in America near to him. I think he's from that same nation anyway, of people who live in that area. And so he was I sat in on a master class that he gave
Okay.
when I was in the States, and he basically spoke about going back, creating this arts festival mostly for the young people in that community. And then I forget which string quartet he booked, but basically there's a resident string quartet, and within 1 week he facilitates these sessions, and the string quartet are there to kind of test out all of these different parameters and ideas for the kids. But I think there was a lot of crossover for me in terms of thinking about composition in South Africa, where we are often in situations where, especially when we're outside of bigger cities or we're in poorer areas of our bigger cities, where arts education is just so minimal. And if I myself, as like someone who's been in private music tuition, since I was like 6 years old, had all kinds of opportunities and privileges, if I also feel a kind of imposter syndrome about composing, with all my, all the privileges that I've enjoyed throughout my whole life, specifically to do with music and developing my own creative voice, I think we really need to deconstruct some of the ways in which we talk about people being able to make music. And there are people who are doing that anyway. Yeah.
Right. However, I think this is super important. This is part of the key to the future of this country. It's working with young people, and the continuity that is required. This project or activities such as this can't be one-off activities. You have to accompany a young person in growing skills and the ability, the own voice. So I find that aspect extremely interesting. There's a question in the chat.
Why do you feel the need to think about composing and music as soft architecture? Thanks, Mates, my homie. Yeah, I think it's a little bit related to what I was saying just now, actually. The fact that I think shout ensemble was really important in that way for me. And also working more in African music and ethnomusicology, where there is overall greater freedom, at least in scholarship. If during my master's, there was so much emphasis on kind of composing and drawing, not having those kind of prerequisites. And there wasn't the same kind of construction around if someone is a serious person, serious enough to be a composer, or have the very particular, if I can do a piano reduction of an orchestral score in like 10 seconds and play it then I'm not a real composer. All of these kinds of judgments and barriers that kind of stop people from making music. I think I felt like for a few years I've been exploring with just drawing from other disciplines where we have so many similar kind of elements. There's some conceptual idea, there's some kind of creation, there's some kind of way of remembering that, and then there's a performance or an articulation of whatever those first intentions are. And so just trying to get some kind of inspiration from other spaces and other disciplines that I definitely myself wouldn't want to belong to. I would definitely not want to be an architect. But at the same time, I think it's just that freedom of borrowing from another space and then being able to just to see how it applies, see how it translates, and then work out. Yeah, there's some kind of freedom in that, I think. Definitely I've found that. And I think it's that freedom that I've been searching for, that I saw in Raven Chacon's work, that we experienced in the shout ensemble, but also, I think many people achieve that freedom within conventional classical music anyway. It just wasn't available. It wasn't going to work for me. So I think I think that's why I like this idea of soft and hard architecture. There's all kinds of other stuff to do with like decoloniality, and that's why I wanted to talk a little bit about hierarchy, because I think that's quite important, and that applies to ideas around composition in the academy and in classical music, but then also just the academy in general. Like,
Right.
academia has a whole lot of hard and soft architectures that you have to navigate. And I think a lot of what's written
Yeah.
about decoloniality is trying to bring that softness out and those strategies that subvert the fixed paths we're supposed to be on or that we find ourselves on.
Right. There's an excellent, um, uh, not a question, but rather a comment. The the person is quite intrigued and inspired by the notion of soft architecture applied to soft musicking.
Mm.
Any does it resonate with you at all? Obviously, but how? In which ways?
Yeah, thanks for that comment. Yeah, I think they definitely see there's a lot of potential in this. I think this was just, this presentation was just literally the kind of initial,
The, yeah.
my initial thinking around it, mostly just because I was thrown into the deep end by all these architects that I was working with. But I think there is a lot of potential in thinking about, um, well, a lot of Small's ideas around musicking anyway, I think kind of bring out a lot of softness that we hadn't necessarily thought through before that, in terms of who's partaking in things, how musical experiences are enjoyed and experienced, who's allowed to do that. I think there's something else, slightly related to this, that I think is important. I've been thinking a lot more about music and healing and the emotional side of composing and creating music in different ensembles. It's something I veered away from in the past, just because there's so many. I'm very jazz adjacent here in Joburg, and there are a lot of jazz people who've gone into the spiritual and emotional in their music in a way that is quite exhausting for me. But yeah, just thinking about the soft ways in which creativity works actually for most people, and then the language and literature and infrastructure we then put on it to harden it up. But for everybody, there are these kinds of, they're emotional and creative and intellectual things that are either unexpected or are important personally or creatively, or lead to all these other kind of pathways. So I think, thank you for that comment. I'm definitely going to think it through and go back to Christopher Small and think that through. But I think at least these initial discussions really just show how just one concept
Yeah.
misapplied from somewhere else can really open things up.
Yeah. Yeah. Cara, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the concert this evening, and yeah, keep up the good work. Fantastic.
Thank you, Theo. Thanks for having me
Thank
again.
you.
Appreciate it.
Cool. Bye.